Hello all, for those of you that are just joining us, welcome to Save Money by Reducing Your Log Volume with Log Patterns and SubAccounts. We've got our host, Greg Lucas here, who's gonna provide a lot of great content. Some housekeeping items before we get started. We'll be taking questions at the end of the webinar. Please feel free to ask any and post them in the chat room throughout the presentation. Additionally, we'll be sending out the recording at the end of the week, so you'll have on-demand access. Hi, Greg, and thank you so much for hosting this today. What do you have for us?
Awesome, thanks, Gwen. Hey, everyone, I'm gonna lead a webinar today that talks about saving money by reducing your log volume and talk specifically about some functionality that Logz.io provides to do that. So let me just go ahead and share out my screen here. Okay. So save money, reduce log volume with log patterns and sub-accounts. So as I said, my name is Greg Lucas. I'm a solution architect with Logz.io. I've been here a little over 2 years now. Previously coming from a background of computer science and engineering, specifically focusing on UX and front-end design. I actually had the opportunity to lead a business intelligence and reporting team as a product manager prior to moving to solution architecture. So just a quick breakdown of the agenda today. So we're going to talk about 3 different things related to reducing log volume. So we'll talk about the problem first, obviously, but three features related to it that Logz.io specifically takes into account for helping you reduce your log volume. Sub-accounts, which enables control of your log volume, access, and retention. I think those of you that are already existing Logz.io customers know the capabilities of sub-accounts. Log patterns, a way to turn your big data small. So this is a way to group millions of log messages into smaller groups of logs and either surface noise that wasn't existent prior that maybe you didn't know about, and also the ability to sift out noise to find the root cause of something or find that needle in a haystack. The final topic will be around functionality that we've just released recently called drop filters. This is a way to dynamically drop logs based on predefined filters. A good example of this is debug logs, and one of the powerful things here is that you're not, as a Logz.io customer, this is a way to prevent specific subsets of data from being ingested into the platform. So let's talk about the problem first. So mainly how logging can get costly. I think a lot of us can recognize the sheer importance and criticality of logs and what it gives you in terms of value for being able to troubleshoot and identify an issue. There's logs everywhere, right? We're moving to more modern architectures with distributed cloud workloads and microservices, and that potentially runs into an issue of having verbose logging that maybe doesn't provide as much value. And the reality is that all needs to be stored somewhere, right? There might be something that happened, a specific event that was present in your log data that would give you information about downtime, for example. But obviously there's a cost associated with that. So what's your resolution? What are some ways to solve this, right? Some things that you might think about. Simply just ship less data. Maybe you identify some services that might not provide value. Now the risk there is that those might be the answers for troubleshooting some of your issues. The second is compressing and archiving your data, right? You have to set up some sort of technical integration for actually compressing data, based on whether or not it's stored in something like an S3 bucket or on premise directly on a machine. The last part, which I'll talk a little bit about today, is log according to best practices. So Logz.io has provided some guidance through our logs, through our customer success team, and some other channels about how to log properly and give yourselves the most value in terms of what types of messages are best to have on the platform on a regular basis, and what are some standard practices to have in terms of logging on a key value field level basis. So the first thing I want to talk about is sub-accounts. For those of you that aren't familiar with SubAccounts, the functionality in Logz.io, this is a way to logically separate your data within a Logz.io account. So on the right here, you can see a screenshot that shows the SubAccount functionality. In this instance, this is a screenshot of a SubAccount that's configured for an account called Demo Logz.io. It has a 30 gigabyte plan associated with it, and there's 14-day retention. Now, typically what we see across our customer base for how some of our top customers leverage SubAccounts functionality, breaking it down by environment, by team, by application, which in the instance of this screenshot here, you see that we're breaking it down by environment. So we have our dev environment, maybe we have something coming from our Kubernetes services, our non-prod environments, et cetera. With each of these SubAccounts, you can configure a total daily volume that can act as a throttling mechanism. Now, one of the reasons you might want to do that is to prevent overlogging from a specific service. So I think all of us can probably agree on that the dev data is probably not as critical as production data. And so if you're on a 30 gigabyte plan and you all of a sudden blow through that 30 gigabyte quota within a specific day, being able to limit the amount of dev data can be critical to actual troubleshooting your data and allocating more towards the production environment. Logz.io also has built-in overage to all of our contracts. I think that most of you know our licensing includes by default a 20% overage that allows for bursts of data on a specific day and time period. That is completely customizable on an as-needed basis. The second option here is the retention period. This allows for a couple different things. Number one, you might have compliance requirements for only keeping data for a specific time period, maybe 5 to 7 days compared to the overall retention on the account. The second incentive for assigning specific retention periods to SubAccounts is to allow yourself to have a modularized plan, so you can have custom pricing based on the varying retention. Cool. Second thing I'm going to go into is log patterns. This is a functionality that Logz.io recently released. What log patterns does is it automatically identifies groups of logs as they come into the system. So everything that comes in on the message field, we're analyzing that set of data, and we're building a library of log patterns as they flow in. And as more logs flow in, we can look at the data in real time and see what are the most consistent log patterns within the environment. So in this instance here, the screenshot shows a list of all of the logs that have been present in the past 24 hours. So we're looking at the time period of today and looking at a total of 878,000 log messages. And if we switch to the adjacent patterns tab that's available in the Discover view within Kibana, this is something that Logz.io has added, you get an automatic analysis of all the top producing log patterns based on the time period and the search, which in this instance, the search is just a wildcard. It's just looking at all of the log data. So we can see based on everything coming into this account within Logz.io, what are the top log messages that we're producing? And when we scroll down this list, you can see a couple of things we're giving. Obviously the counts of that specific log pattern, and then the ratio, what percentage does it represent of the total number of messages within that search and time frame. And the last column here is the actual pattern itself, right? So you might have messages that are just a static message, right? In this instance, the top one here is proxy request to services sent. That had occurred 156,000 times within the past 24 hours. But if you see some of the messages below, you'll notice that we've highlighted a verb here called number. This is a variable that we're extracting from the log messages themselves. So this can be a rotating number that we've identified in the set of data and automatically analyze and strip that out. So in the instance of this account number was created waiting for Kibana indexes to be created. So this could be account number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? We automatically clustered those together and we identified how often this was happening. A couple things that this might give you in terms of a value perspective. So one for investigating and troubleshooting issues, right? Maybe you recognize proxy request to services sent. Maybe you recognize master posting number alerts definition to check. You have the ability to quickly filter for and filter out that data to get to a root cause more quickly. That's number one. Number two is this also would surface potentially noisy logs within your set of messages. for the purposes of, again, finding maybe noise that wasn't present earlier and now is present within a specified time period. This is also a way to do analysis on your sets of logs for maybe logs that aren't providing value. So if you're in an instance where you're overlogging to Logz.io and you're constantly running up against your planned volume, this is a way to help identify and then reduce the data. Ways to reduce the data: one, you could temporarily disable it with drop filters, which we'll get into in a little bit. The second would be actually to go to the source of how the data is coming in. So for example, if you were shipping data from an instance, basically, let's just call it reading a log file with the agent called FileBeat, and you were sending logs, FileBeat has an option to exclude specific lines of logs based on a pattern, which in this case, you could identify a regex, include that in the exclude lines option, and then those logs wouldn't get sent to Logz.io. That's a use case for just logs that you'll never need within the Logz.io platform. So it's a way to exclude them and not pay for the actual ingest and storage of the data within Logz.io. Cool. So how log patterns works, right? So we identify the two outer variables here, constant, and that number as variables is what I talked about earlier. And that's what produces this log patterns. One thing that's a major differentiator in terms of the log pattern functionality is that this analysis is occurring with every single log event that comes into Logz.io. And so we're constantly building the library and improving it over time. And then when you switch to the log tabs, that library is already pre-built. So when you search on a subset of data or you change a time frame within the platform, it's going to be much more performant in terms of pulling up that list of log patterns and allow you to drill down to that root cause much faster. Compared to some other platforms that have functionality similar to this, those run analysis at the execution time of running the log pattern analysis. This is already pre-built, so it's an instantaneous retrieval in terms of surfacing the log patterns. All right, the last topic I want to talk about is drop filters. Drop filters is a functionality that was released recently. For those of you that are customers, you probably got a notification in the top menu bar within Logz.io. There's a little star icon that shows up whenever we release new functionality and surface that announcement to our customers. This is a way to dynamically drop data based on filters. And what's most important here is there's no cost that's incurred for the dropped subset of logs. The drop filters are accessed from the cogwheel in the top right, which is where all your settings and administrative options are. So it's the cogwheel on the top right of the Logz.io application. Then you just go to the tools drop down and drop filter. So it's a new landing page that you can go to. By default, you can currently define up to 10 drop filters within the application. And it's as simple as when you add a new drop filter, all you're required to do is define the actual field that we want to identify and drop, and then also the value for which data we want to drop. And then you'll notice on the far right in the screenshot here, there's a toggle option. So this is a way for you to dynamically toggle on and off whether or not a specific subset of data is coming in. And one of the things I talked about in the beginning of the webinar was the ability to drop data based on, for example, debug level logs. Again, I think we can all agree upon that debug level logs aren't necessarily always useful, but in times of troubleshooting an ongoing incident, they can provide a lot of value. So this is a way for you to send all your logs to Logz.io, have the debug logs temporarily disabled within the account. And let's say there's an hour-long period where those logs would provide immense value. You have the ability to toggle this back on quickly. Maybe this is coming from application logs. Maybe this is coming from a server infrastructure. As soon as you toggle that data, this drop filter back on, that data will be flowing within the account within Logz.io. So here are a couple references I'll send out. This will be included in the presentation that we send out after the recording. For the next few minutes here, I'm actually going to go through and provide just a quick demo on some of these functionalities. So we're going to go through and quickly show how log patterns works show the filtering for, filtering against, and then we're also going to showcase drop filters and SubAccounts. All right, you should be able to see my Logz.io screen now. So when we're within Logz.io, a couple of things. I think for those of you that are existing Logz.io customers, you probably recognize the interface here. This is the Kibana, this panel for when you first log in. So this is a very familiar interface for those of you that are existing customers or that are currently trying out the platform. The Kibana interface allows you to search all of your log data. One thing you'll notice if you have stood up your own vanilla elk stack in the past is that you'll notice that this patterns tab is not here if you are leveraging your own Kibana environments. So I'm looking at data over the last 15 minutes. We have 7,000 messages. And when I switch to the patterns tab, you'll notice how quickly it pulls back their results. And we can see a breakdown of the past 15 minutes and what the top producing messages are. Now, if I were to expand this to 24 hours, it's also going to update this list of patterns as well based on the past 24 hours of all the data. You can see how quickly it finds that data. Now, a couple of things when we're in the patterns tab. You'll notice when I mouse over each row, I have a couple icons that show up here. One is the filter for that pattern. Now, if I do that, what this will do is do a search on all of the data within my environment. So if I want to see the message specifically related to going to process auto scale for group, and I click the plus magnifying glass icon here, that's going to apply a filter within Kibana and automatically switch back to the logs tab so that we can begin doing analysis of what exactly this is. And as you can see, that dynamic number was automatically stripped from the message within the environment. And if I switch back to the patterns tab here, you'll notice this is now a filter that's been applied within Kibana. If I click the remove filter, it's going to automatically run the analysis on the data. The second option is filtering that pattern out. So as I remove filters, it's going to reanalyze everything and look at the percentage which represents all the patterns within the time period and the search. And so I can do this to drill down to a root cause. If I want to filter that message out, then I want to filter out the master posting number alert definitions to check message out. You'll notice we can get down lower and lower in terms of what data sets we're looking at. And you notice that at the same time, it's reducing the number of messages that we're looking at in terms of the logs themselves. Now, something also important to note is that let's say there's a specific type of data that I want to look at. So in this instance, I'm going to look at data coming from one of the application logs in here. So I'm going to look at the My Secret App logs. You'll notice that when I apply a filter based on a search, right? So let's say we were looking at data within the logs tab here. And if I apply a filter within the search, and then I wanted to switch to logs. So now we're only looking at one specific set of application data within the last 24 hours. So it's only 16,000 events. And I go to the patterns, it's only going to give the patterns to that specific query. Right? So in this instance, we have 50% of our messages that have some sort of pattern of session ID occurring within it. And then 24% representing starting transaction for session and then a GUID. So if I filter for that data, what you'll notice is the end of this message includes a unique identifier every single time. Now, in theory, let's just say that we didn't want to send this data to Logz.io ever. It represented data that wasn't valuable in terms of troubleshooting. One of the things we can do is add a drop filter for filtering out this data, specifically based on this message, or maybe the My Secret app itself. The second thing we can do is bring us back to the agent that actually sent this data in the first place. So based on the pattern in this message, we would want to drop the data. This would be a way to reduce the volume, right? So instead of sending over the last 24 hours these 4,000 messages, we have the ability to drop them permanently and then not incur a cost or not get charged for the actual ingest of that data. Awesome. So next thing I'll show you is drop filters and exactly how that works. And the example that I'm going to use is dropping data from our dev environment temporarily. So I'm going to use this value here, env, and then the value dev. And you'll recognize that this actually represents about 50% of the data from the past 24 hours. This is a way for us to temporarily enable and disable that data. So as mentioned, drop filters is accessible from the gear icon, tools, then drop filter. From the screen, you recognize the two filters that we had seen in the presentation. To add a new filter, all you have to do is click the add drop filter button. We can by default select the log type. So if we knew which log type we wanted to drop, we could easily do that. And then all you have to do is select the field, which in this case we're doing it in the environment field. And we're going to drop anything with the value of dev. Now you have the ability to drop more than, you can do more matches in this, right? So if it was environment dev and maybe it was a specific message type or maybe from a specific service, you could absolutely add more of that data. There's a little note here, drop logs don't actually arrive on your Logz.io account, so they can't be searched or trigger any alerts. So after confirming that message, we can actually apply the drop filter. Now, important to note, for those of you that know about the S3 archiving functionality that comes with Logz.io, all of the data will actually still get archived to your S3 bucket if that's set up. So that's something that is important to you. It's just important to note that we still actually maintain backups in a centralized location of all of your data. So that's something that comes as an added benefit to you where you don't incur the cost within Logz.io, but you have the ability to re-ingest data for the fact of maybe after the fact you get a month down the road and there was a specific set of data that you were dropping via drop filters, you could easily restore it within the context of your Logz.io account. So after I hit the apply filter button, now this will start dropping all of my data that has a match on the key value pair environment dev. And if I were to quickly disable this toggle here, that would deactivate that drop filter. So now I'm actually re-ingesting that data again. If I want to delete one, I can click the mouse over and delete it. And now I'm left with the existing set. So a good example. So now I mentioned the debug logs. By default, I imagine that most people, if they're sending debug logs, they may or may not want them. And most of the time they're going to have those debug logs dropped. This is going to be activated by default. Instance of troubleshooting, you would come to the drop filter screen, you would quickly disable the drop filter, and then you could immediately see the debug logs available within Kibana, and they're completely searchable. All right, last functionality I'm going to talk about is sub-account management. And then I'll leave the floor open for any questions from the audience. So we're within the sub-accounts functionality screen here. You can see as presented in the presentation, we have a 30 gigabyte account configured for this demo account here, and there's 14-day retention, and we have a total allowance of 15 sub-accounts that can be allocated. Each sub-account within Logz.io needs a minimum allocation of 1 gigabyte. So in theory, on a 30 gigabyte plan, you could have up to 30 sub-accounts if that was required. A lot of our customers will group sub-accounts, as mentioned earlier, based on service, application, environments, maybe region. So we have with those customers that are, I think, have upwards of 100 sub-accounts across terabytes of data, and that they configure it depending on the pure volume of data that they're sending into the platform. As mentioned, you have your configuration options of total daily volume, your retention period. So this is completely customizable per sub-account. You'll also notice there's a unique token per sub-account. So when each of these tokens are configured within Logz.io, this is the token that's associated with your shipping method. So when you assign a token to a specific agent, for example, so if you set up FileBeat and you have it point to the Logz.io listener, the token is what represents the routing for making sure the data is securely sent to your account. On the right here, there's a couple advanced options. Number one, if you're not leveraging something like single sign-on and you're using username and password authentication for your accounts, you have the ability to enable everyone who's defined in the main account, which in this instance is the demo Logz.io account, for them to have access to that sub-account. And again, that's configurable on a sub-account basis. The second checkbox is the ability to search from the main account. This allows you to actually be logged into the demo Logz.io account, and then I can actually search everything in the K8S sub-account. And that's all available in the selected accounts dropdown that shows up on the left here when you have that option turned on. So if you're not seeing this option turned on, it's probably because you haven't made a sub-account searchable from the main account yet, or you don't have any timeless accounts currently configured. The last two options here, one is save account utilization metrics. So this is something that actually saves a metric into the account every 10 minutes, 30 minutes, or 60 minutes. So you can specify the interval. It comes in as its own message. So it comes in as type Logz.io _account_utilization. And this is a real-time measurement of the size of your data as it's present in Elasticsearch within Logz.io. So you as a customer have complete visibility into the exact measurement of data real-time throughout the day. This is also a way to identify in a specific sub-account how much data it's sending, and in turn help you potentially identify volume noise as it comes in throughout the day and potentially apply that to reduce specific sets of volume. The second is this save log size. This actually is a measurement of the actual log event as it comes into the platform. A couple things that affect log size, obviously the length of the message field, and that's number one. And number two are the amount of fields associated with the event as it's in Logz.io. So the longer your message field is and the more fields you have within a specific event, the larger that message is going to represent. Generally, what we see within Elasticsearch and Logz.io from a measurement perspective is it's about a 1 kilobyte per message average for data as it comes into the platform. So that's an easy way to do some very rough math in terms of estimating log volumes. You can obviously expand that or reduce that based on the enrichment of the log events themselves. Cool. All right. So with that, I am actually going to leave the floor open to a few questions. I think I already got a couple that came in at the beginning of the webinar. So I'm going to keep the chat window open here for about 5 or 10 minutes. I'm going to answer the 2 questions I got that were sent prior to the webinar, and then if anyone else has any questions, feel free to post it in the chat that's available in the GoToMeeting webinar panel. All right, hold on 1 second. All right, first question comes from one of our existing customers actually. I have deployed Logz.io Kubernetes via the Fluentd daemon set and are now pushing all of our container logs to Logz.io. I want to cut down these logs to just Nginx or application logs only. So that's a great question. There are a couple ways you could go about doing this. I know with the Kubernetes logs specifically coming out of those containers, and I'm assuming you're logging everything to standard out. One of the things you can do is you can provide a tag for those specific services as they come out of the daemon set, and you can either filter them out on the agent side, or if they come into Logz.io and if there's a field that can help identify the Nginx or the application logs based on some sort of tag, or maybe it's embedded in the type, you can drop the data via the drop filters within Logz.io. So that's a way to help reduce volumes and stay within your account configuration limits. If there are any other questions regarding that, I would recommend first reaching out to Logz.io support. Second would be to strategize with your customer success engineer. For those of you that aren't Logz.io customers, I think you're probably aware of your customer success engineering team, and we can help you strategize and specifically how to take care of those things. Awesome. Second question, how to create a dashboard, alerts, and visualize those logs. That was actually covered in a previous webinar. So one of the links that we'll actually include is a link to that webinar on how to actually create alerts and visualize logs within the platform. If you're an existing customer, again, I recommend reaching out to your customer success team. I think you most likely have a customer success engineer assigned to your account. If you're currently not a customer, maybe you opened up a trial, you probably have an account manager assigned to you, and we can work with you to get you an assigned technical resource for getting started with Logz.io. Awesome. A couple more questions. If I have 3 environments, how can I create a sub-account for each environment logs? It's a great question. So I think I covered that in the sub-account management section. Essentially what you do in the manage sub-account screen is you would create a sub-account for each environment. So let's just call it dev, production, and QA. You saw that there's a token that gets generated. So there's each time a sub-account's created, we generate a unique token for those sub-accounts. And then when you set up your agents for shipping data from each of those environments, make sure you point the data to that specific token and the listener within Logz.io. And that ensures what the data gets into that account. Again, I think general theme of all these questions is if there's any questions beyond this in terms of account configuration, reach out to the Logz.io chat support that's available in application, as well as your customer success team. All right, here's another one. Can a drop filter be defined from an auto-created log pattern? That is a great question. I'm not sure if that's currently possible. I think one way of doing that, so important to note for those of you who don't know, a lot of the parsing configurations that occur on your account, we leverage a technology called Sawmill that Logz.io actually open sourced sometime, I think about 1.5 years ago. And Sawmill is an extension, think of it as like Logstash, how we just removed the shipping portion of that technology and then did a benchmark performance against Logstash, and I think it beat it on the realm of 10x or maybe more in terms of performance, but it has all the same functionality that Logstash has. And when you actually apply a drop filter, we have a mechanism that essentially creates a Sawmill configuration. So it generates a parsing on the back end to actually drop the data. And that's one of the options that's available with any parsing. So for any complex parsing requirements, we can drop data on things like a regex pattern. Currently, it's not supported through the drop filter UI, although that's something we're exploring. Does the drop filter accept partial messages or filter messages that contain text, but not the full message? So again, same thing as the last question. If there's more complex requirements, you can work with support right in the app for dropping subsets of data. Or more importantly, is if it's data that needs to be permanently dropped, we actually recommend dropping it at the agent level. How long is the data available if it's part of a drop filter? So if the drop filter is deactivated, it'll be available in the accounts for the period, the retention period configured for that sub account. If the drop filter is activated the entire time, the data is never searchable within Kibana. If you had S3 archiving turned on, it would be available there. Question number 5, when should I use a sub account? What are the typical cases and examples for creating a sub account? Again, I think I covered this specifically, but just to reiterate, some of the typical use cases we see here for sub accounts are breaking down your log data by environment, by development team, by application, by service. I wouldn't recommend if it's to break it down to make data more easily searchable. One of the reasons being is you can imagine that the more sub accounts you have, the more difficult the maintenance is of your Logz.io account is. So I would be more strategic in terms of how you leverage sub accounts. Again, we're happy to work with you and what makes sense for your organization. All right. Can the new pattern tool be leveraged in tandem with drop filters, i.e. can a pattern be selected as a drop filter? Not currently. Again, that's something we're working on and tying the two together. If there is a pattern that you guys need to be dropped either permanently or temporarily, we can work with you on that. And then number 7 is the 10 drop filter limit global or per sub account. I'm pretty sure it's on a per sub account basis. I'd have to check with you on that. if there are any more questions, definitely ask your customer success engineer assigned to your account.
Thank you so much, Greg, and thank you all for being such an engaging audience. Those were some great questions. One more question that was asked. Yes, this will be available as a recording to watch on demand. Sadly, we don't have a webinar next week, but we'll let you all know when we'll be back in action. Thanks again, Greg.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.
Bye, guys.